Good morning. I want to start things off this morning by telling you a story about a woman named Ange Sabin Peter. Ange Sabin Peter, and she was this very, very accomplished potter who served this 6-month internship, well, not really internship, apprenticeship under the famed Japanese potter Masaki Shibata. But before journeying to Japan, Ange, she imagined herself and what this experience would be like.
Hello, my friend.
Hey, Scott Halter, what's up?
Nice to have you here with us again.
Hey, didn't he do a great job up here this morning? That was great, leading us. All right. So, Ange Sabin Peter, before she went on this trip to Japan, she daydreamed. She kind of imagined herself learning under this skilled craftsman and artist that she long admired. She imagined herself creating and shaping beautiful pottery on this wheel with his decades of skill sharpening her own experience. But usually, an apprentice with this acclaimed potter apprenticeship lasted about 4 years or so. But because of her experience, Ange, she thought that she could just do a little short tutorial with this Japanese potter and be good. But at the start of the apprenticeship, Ange, she knew little to nothing about this ancient Japanese tradition of becoming an uchideshi. Can y'all say that with me? Uchideshi. I just want us to say words, pronounce words that we're not used to pronouncing. I think I might have mispronounced that a little bit. But now y'all are in with the mispronunciation with me, so I'm not alone. So, the uchideshi, and that is one who does an apprenticeship under a skilled craftsman. And to learn a skill, what would happen is a teenage boy would be adopted into a master's household, essentially living as a member of the family, participating in everyday life, the everyday life of the family, from menial tasks to more housework. So it was so much more than learning to throw and glaze pottery. It was about becoming more like the master in absolutely every aspect of life, from menial tasks to things that were bigger. It wasn't until after 4 years in this apprenticeship, that an uchideshi would be trusted to begin to create elegant works of pottery. But on her first day, Shibata sent Ange into the rice fields to dig for clay instead of inviting her to his wheel to watch him do pottery. Her pride got the best of her after days of doing this under the hot sun, not being able to demonstrate her own skills that she had learned. In fact, during her 6 months apprenticeship, Shibata didn't allow Ange to throw one piece of pottery. It was one day at lunch, and Shibata's wife was talking with Ange, and she shared with her, she said, "When you came to us, you were like a fully grown tree with big branches. But we've had to cut those branches for something new to be able to grow." And that sounds nice, that sounds good, but Ange didn't take it that way, because the word that stuck out to her was that word cut. Because that didn't have the best implications, because it showed in her mind that something wasn't right. Something had to be cut away. But once she returned home, Ange, she felt absolutely deflated. She felt somewhat defeated, thinking that her 6-month apprenticeship was all for nothing. It was a big waste. But when she sat down at the wheel for the first time since she had got home, she began to sense these very subtle differences. Something incredible had happened, and something had changed. And without even knowing it, she had absorbed this new way of thinking, this new way of doing things. Something about her work had become more appealing to the eye. Her new way of thinking was this result of paying attention to this master craftsman and experiencing a season of having her branches cut off so that she could become better at what she was already good at. So, we've been on quite a journey the last 7 weeks. This is the 7th week, but we've been in this sermon series together looking at these 7 I am statements of Jesus. And what has Jesus been doing in this series? Well, he's been kind of picking these fights, picking these cultural fights, especially when it came to these gods who were being served. They would promise one thing, but Jesus is actually like, no, all these different gods are promising all these different things. You realize all these things come from me? Because I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. Jesus, I am the good shepherd. I'm the resurrection and the life. I'm the way. I am the truth and the life. But then we reach week 7 today, in which Jesus shares another truth by saying that I am the true vine. And as I've been studying for this message, I can't help but to think that maybe this statement, maybe it's the most intimate one that Jesus shares, not necessarily because all the other ones weren't important, but just the circumstances that Jesus is under when he shares this. He's not in front of large crowds. He's not combating with the religious leaders, but instead he's in an upper room with his disciples, delivering some final teachings before he goes to the cross. If you got your Bibles with you this morning, I encourage you to go ahead and turn to John 15. John 15 with me, that is where we are going to be camping out together. But just kind of set the stage and give us a little bit of context of what is going on. This is known as Jesus' upper room discourse. Jesus and his disciples are partaking in the Passover meal. During this meal, he's washed the feet of his disciples. Judas Iscariot, he's been identified as the betrayer. The group has been warned against deserting Jesus over the next few days and beyond. He specifically kind of points out Peter, right, during this. These are his final teachings before his arrest as he's preparing his remaining disciples and propelling them for what is going to be taking place over really that night, the next few days, and beyond. Beginning in John 15:1, Jesus, he presents this beautiful picture using this metaphor of the vine and the branches. Jesus shares, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are always clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit, but apart from me you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. So hopefully, we have this picture in our minds of what Jesus is talking about. Okay, he's saying, I am the true vine, Jesus. The Father is the gardener, and us, the disciples, we are the branches. But what exactly is Jesus saying here? Because the thing is that he's saying a lot more to these men than originally meets the eye. Jesus, and Scott has been sharing this, he uses imagery, he uses things that people were already familiar with. He wasn't using something that he just kind of made up. He wasn't necessarily being original. He was using things that connected with what was happening in people's lives. People were familiar with this. This was not this new metaphor. Vineyards, they were everywhere in this area, especially up at the north in Galilee. This made it for a very, very good environment for some of the best tasting wine. You would oftentimes see vineyards or vines in people's yards. That's how that was just part of their everyday life. But more importantly, the vine, the vineyard metaphor, was one of the most used images in Judaism to express God's relationship with his people. In the Old Testament, Israel is depicted as this vine or as this vineyard. Listen to what the psalmist says in Psalm 80, verses 8 through 11. He says this. He says, "You transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade. The mighty cedars with its branches. Its branches reached as far as the sea. Its shoots as far as the river." So that kind of makes sense. If you know anything about Israel's history, Israel is the vine. They spent 400 years or so in Egyptian captivity and slavery. God snips them. He cuts them out of that slavery. He transplants them into this land called Canaan, which we know of as the Promised Land. And it's there that God's people are given this special attention and care. This imagery, it sheds Israel's situation in good light, producing positive momentum. However, the next part of this psalm produces some mixed emotions for us, and would have for the disciples. And here's what we read, verse 12, "Why have you broken down its walls so that all pass by pick its grapes? Boars from the forest ravage it, and insects from the fields feed on it. Now, you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have already done for it?" So God, he withdrew his protection from Israel, the vine, and it was destroyed by these other nations. But why would God withdraw his protection? What made this once prosperous vineyard become essentially a wasteland? Well, let's read what the prophet Isaiah has to share. It says in Isaiah 5, 3 through 5, the words of the Lord, we read, "When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedges, and it will be destroyed. I will break down its walls, and it will be trampled." So despite all of God's generosity, despite all of his protection and care for his people, they still did not produce the fruit that he desired for them to bear. Now, instead of viewing this metaphor in light of God saving a nation of Israel out of Egyptian captivity, the tone turns way more somber. The image of Israel being the vine or the vineyard now turns into this analogy of God's judgment, an image of all of Israel's past failures. But I want you to remember who Jesus is speaking to here. He's speaking with his disciples. He's speaking to some of his closest friends, Jewish men who would have been familiar with their history, with their heritage. A thoughtful Jew would not have missed the implications of the vineyard analogy, one consisting of a long line of failure after failure after failure. A long line of history where there were moments in which God's chosen people missed the mark. Expectations weren't met. But it's here that Jesus completely flips the script. And he presents a fresh and new way of looking at this analogy of the vineyard for these men, of the vine. Instead of the vineyard of the vine represented failure after failure after failure of a nation, the imagery of the vine, it now represents one individual. And who is that individual? You can answer. It's Jesus. It's Jesus Christ. Instead of reminders of their failures from the past, the vine now represents redemption. This imagery is no longer about the past. It now represented something greater than their struggles, greater than their failures, the moments when their hard-headedness just got the best of them. You see, God's people are no longer defined as people now transplanted in the vineyard of Israel, but as people who are now attached to Jesus, the true vine. See, Jesus' description of this relationship between him, the vine, and us, the branches, it's used to describe our deep need to constantly be connected with him. One's identity being now defined by their attachment to the vine. So if there is one word that I could use to describe everything that Jesus says in these 8 verses or so, it would be the word abide. Abide. It's all about abiding. It's all about remaining in him, as we read in verse 4. But before we go on, I do want to give just a little bit of a warning. And the warning is that we cannot bear the fruit God desires to see in our lives unless we remain connected to the vine. It's about remaining connected to the true vine in Jesus. You can't bear fruit by yourself. Jesus, he shares in our text that it's impossible to bear the fruit he desires for us to bear if we do not remain in him. He goes a step further in verse 6. Check that out again. Look back down there about what happens. He says, if you do not remain in me, you're like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. So as we look at this and consider the fruit that we are bearing, before we ask ourselves, why am I not bearing fruit? What's going on here? The answer can usually be found by answering another question. By asking yourself, am I remaining attached? Am I remaining connected to the true vine? So as we continue, here's what I want to do this morning. I want us to really put our attention, put our focus on verse 2. With what verse 2 of John 15 has to share with us about the idea of cutting off and the idea of pruning and what that looks like spiritually. So the first part of verse 2 is just a little bit confusing. Check that out. Jesus, he says, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. So why would God cut me off from the vine if I'm not bearing fruit? Well, the way that we think of that word cut off, it's not exactly what Jesus is saying here about how we would view that word. It's not the exact image being portrayed. The Greek word that is used here is this Greek word eri. This Greek word eri. And what this means, it means to raise up. It means to lift up. It doesn't mean to completely detach. And when you read it in that light, it completely changes the game. It changes the way that we view this meaning. We can read it, instead of he cuts off, we can say he lifts up every branch in me that bears no fruit. He lifts up every branch that bears no fruit. Here's what would happen. The gardener would take part of the vine that was about to lay on the ground, or it produces raw fruit, and he would tie it up, allowing more room for the branch to grow. He may sit it up on a rock or a piece of wood to help it grow. It's really more of a visual of restoration, but it also can only happen by being attached to the true vine. I want to show y'all something. I want you to look at this picture. There we go. Oops. There's this ancient Japanese art form called kintsugi. And what this is they would take a broken piece of pottery, such as that. That looks pretty cool. I could maybe put that on display on my coffee table or something, but you tried to drink water out of it or tried to pour water out of it, it wouldn't work very well, would it? It just wouldn't. So what this ancient Japanese art form does is it takes broken pieces of pottery, they melt like this golden mixture, and they put the pot back together. I don't know about you, but that looks way better, way more beautiful, simply because of the gold that has been put in between the cracks, than if this wasn't broken apart. You know, God, he likes to take things that are broken, things that are just messed up, and he likes to put them back together, making them even more beautiful, even more precious than they were before. And this morning, I don't know exactly what all of us may be going through, but there may be those of us who really need to hear this morning. Perhaps you are growing weary. Perhaps you are worn. Maybe you are feeling broken. It gets beginning of fall. It's a really, really busy time. You wake up and now you got to start getting your kids ready for school. I know some of us just started getting kids ready this past week. Even if you're at private school, homeschooled, you've probably been in school for a little while already. But not only that, you get the kids ready for school, then you got to go to work. And maybe you don't have the best relationship with your boss or your coworkers. Things don't seem to be gelling together. Guilford County Schools just started back this past Monday, right? And it's just now hitting you guys that you now have these deadlines that you have to meet. You're experiencing the stress of having to reprioritize things. It's a season in life in which it can be really, really difficult for fruit to be shown or for fruit to be produced. But my encouragement for you this morning, if that's something that you're experiencing, allow the gardener to lift you up. Allow him to lift you up, to continue creating something beautiful, something that's going to bear fruit. And that leads to what Jesus talks about in the second part of verse 2 about those who do bear fruit. He talks about those who are struggling and then about those who do bear fruit. Well, every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. I remember growing up, really, really young. My dad and we put this apple tree, we planted this apple tree in our backyard. And I don't remember a lot of the specifics, but I remember going out there, planting this tree. Remember the dirt. I was young, so I loved playing in the dirt. And when Dad would water it, I'd play in the mud, and he wasn't too happy about that. But I remember putting like a little fence around this apple tree so that deer and other critters couldn't get to it. But I remember one day in particular, it was kind of hot, and Dad, he was up in a ladder trimming some branches, and I was the ladder holder. And I don't pride myself on a lot of things, but if you need a ladder holder, I'm probably one of the best ladder holders, okay? So my dad, he's up at the tree, he's pruning it, and it was hot, and I'm doing really good holding this ladder, but I didn't like being out there. There wasn't a whole lot of shade in the tree. And I remember looking up, and I said, Dad, can't we let this thing just take its course? The branches that are going to die and not produce fruit, they're just not going to do it. Can we just go inside and have Mom cook us something good and drink some lemonade? But he looked down at me, and he said, well, son, I want to do that just as bad as you do. But if we do it and we don't do anything to this tree, the harvest is going to be halted. We want as many apples as possible, right? If we don't do this, you're not going to be able to get that apple pie that your grandma makes. So I said, all right, I'll continue holding the ladder. You know, when we think of God as this gardener, the one who prunes, he does so that growth can happen. Growth can't happen unless a tree is pruned. That produces more fruit. And you know, we've been talking a lot about the tree, about fruit, about the gardener, the true vine, about the branches. But what exactly is Jesus talking about when he says bearing fruit? Well, simply put, what Jesus is talking about is making disciples. You see that, I believe, in the end of verse 8. Showing yourselves to be my disciples. Our mission at Catalyst is to be a church of disciples who make disciples, right? Be a church of disciples who make disciples. That's what this section is all about. Discipleship is being defined as attachment to the true vine in Jesus and about fruit bearing. I like this quote by Gary Burge. He once said, discipleship, it's not just a matter of acknowledging who Jesus is, because really anybody can do that. Maybe it looks different from person to person, but from Christians, we can verbally say, okay, I know who Jesus is. But it's so much more than that. It's about having Jesus spiritually connected to our inner lives. It's about attachment to the vine and bearing fruit, because fruit, it's not just evidence that the branch is alive, but it's evidence that the vine is alive. And we serve a risen Savior, right? Who is alive. He's not dead. That's why Jesus spends verses 9 through 17 discussing the importance of remaining and abiding in His love so that loving others can be a result, so that it can be fruit that is born. So this morning, I want to ask you, you want to see results? You can answer. Yeah, you want to see results? You want to bear fruit? Yes. We want to be a church of disciples who make disciples? Yes. Well, before that can happen, we first and foremost need to abide in Jesus. No, I'm going to be real with y'all this morning. Not that I've been being fake. I'm going to be a little bit more transparent with you. Now, I grew up, my childhood was pretty smooth. Very, very smooth childhood. I shared, I think it was my first sermon since coming on staff with Catalyst, that I grew up with a really, really loving mom, very loving father, great relationship with my brother, even though we had our normal moments of bickering and mischievousness. But I grew up very, very churched, very church. My mom was a church secretary. My dad was a deacon in the church. He's currently an elder at the church that I came here from. Every time the doors of the church were open, we made it a priority to be there. Every time there was a serving opportunity, we dove in head first. Southwest Virginia. It's just what we did, and I'm very, very thankful, very grateful for that. But this story, it goes back to the summer before my senior year of high school. For us seniors, for those of you who are seniors currently, that summer, you just have, at least I did, I had this thought process of, man, this is going to be my year. Both leading into graduation and then going into youth group at church. This was going to be the year of Richie Goat. I was going to get recognition, being looked up to as one of the leaders. I was on the academic team my senior year of high school, and when I share that with people, they give me a funny face. It offends me a little bit. But I was on the academic team when I was a senior in high school. I'm like, yes, I'm going to be a leader of the academic team. People are going to look at me in that light, but more importantly, I valued being a leader in the youth group. However, all of that changed before my senior year of high school. I don't know about you, but I remember that when I was in high school, I began to reach an age of awareness that adults are broken too. I always, when I was a kid, thought adults had it all together. And I began to become aware that maybe they don't. Maybe we don't. We have a little bit of brokenness in our lives. Some of us, a lot of brokenness. We all are broken regardless. I began to see the world in a different light, that people are more broken than I thought. And I say this morning, church hurt is something that is real. It can be devastating because that's not the people you expect to be hurt by, right? So it just kind of becomes this shock when it does happen. And that summer before my senior year of high school, our family experienced it. I won't go into a lot of details, but there was a series of events that led our family with just probably one of the most difficult decisions we had to make in leaving that church. And there are great people there, but church hurt is real. I was really, really upset. Very disappointed. I went through a little stage of depression, seeing how that experience of hurt affected my mom. And if you're around me, you'll learn very quick, you don't mess with my mama. You don't mess with Valerie Goat. You don't mess with Robbie Goat either. That's my dad, but you know he can handle his business. But you don't mess with my brother. You just don't mess with my family. And it hurt to see them hurting. But selfishly, I was thinking, man, this is going to be my year. Youth group, School, academic team, going to go out with a bang. I felt like something was taken away from me. You know how you feel when you have something just absolutely ripped away from you and it leaves you with that empty feeling in your stomach? I'm 12 years removed from that experience. And having the time that I've had to reflect on that summer, I want to share with you a few things that I've learned. First of all, Scott, he shared this last week. He said, just because you've messed up or your life circumstances, the situations you're in seem messed up, it doesn't mean that God has changed his plans for your life. Just because you've messed up doesn't mean God has, and his plans aren't going to change. I feel confident saying I would not have gone into ministry if that situation had not happened. The series of events that took place that launched me into ministry would likely not have been made possible if it wasn't for that one rough summer. However, it's not until recently that I began to discover that during that time, could it be possible that God was pruning me so that I could bear more fruit? I thought I had it all together, and to be honest, I felt relatively good spiritually. I felt strong. I felt like ancient Peter did before she went on that apprenticeship in Japan. But what this taught me is that just because we feel like we're in a good place spiritually doesn't mean that God is done pruning you. Because he had to prune you in the first place to get you where you are. So this morning as we close, it's simple. Abide in Jesus. Abide in his love. Stay attached to the vine. He wants to do something absolutely incredible with your life. There are going to be seasons in which you may be weary, in which you may be broken, seasons when you feel defeated. Allow the gardener to raise you up. There's going to be seasons in your life where you experience pruning, and it may hurt, it may feel uncomfortable at first, but allow the gardener to prune you so that more fruit can be produced and seen. Abide. Abide. Abide.